Hello, and thank you all for taking the time to connect for this seminar. I know you're all very busy, and I appreciate your interest. The presentation should last about 30 minutes, and I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them at the end. So here, I want to consider the questions as to how much of human color perception is due to the anatomy of the eye, and how much of our ability to see distinct colors has been influenced by the culture and societies in which the colors are perceived. I will begin by discussing the insights made by the 19th century British statesman William Gladstone on his examination of the epic poems of Homer, and then continue through the contributions made by the German philologist Lazarus Geiger and the ophthalmologist Hugo Magnus, as well as various ethnologists and anthropologists, including the Englishman W.H.R. Rivers. I will end with a brief analysis of the investigations carried out jointly by the American anthropologists Brent Berlin and Paul Kay in the 1960s and 70s, and some criticisms of the research. It was the British politician and Greek scholar William Gladstone who, in his work Studies on Homer and the Homeric Age, published in 1858, the year before Darwin published his great work, The Origin of Species, was among the first to notice the sparseness of colored language used in Homer's epic poems. In a short chapter at the end of his comprehensive analysis of the poet's Iliad and Odyssey, titled On Homer's Perceptions and Use of Color, Gladstone noted that although Homer had used light in its various forms for his purposes with perhaps greater splendor and effect than any other poet, yet the color adjectives and color descriptions of the poems were not only imperfect, but highly ambiguous and confused. He set out his evidence in 5 points. Firstly, Homer used the same words to describe the colors of various objects which, to the modern mind, are quite different. For example, Homer applies the adjective porphyros, which in later Greek roughly means purple or dark red, to describe blood, a dark cloud, a wave, and a rainbow, and he uses the epithet oinops, wine-looking, to refer to the sea. Gladstone's explanation for this was to suggest that the ancient Greeks categorized colors mainly in terms of light-dark contrasts rather than in terms of hue. Secondly, the same object is described using incompatible color terms. The example he gives is the material iron is in one passage described as violet and in another as gray. In other places, he uses the word Ithon, meaning burning, blazing, or shining, when describing animals such as horses and lions, to refer to the metal. Thirdly, the insignificant use of color, especially in places you might expect it, such as descriptions of animals, or the fact that he never uses the color blue to refer to the sky. Fourthly, his frequent use of elementary black and white over every other color. For example, Homer uses melas, or black, around 170 times and leuco, white, about 100 times. However, this drops dramatically in the use of other colors. Ethros, red, is used 13 times, xanthos, yellow, about 10 times, and other colors even less. Finally, the absence of some of the elementary primary colors, most notably blue. After studying color descriptions of other ancient Greek authors, Gladstone came to a startling conclusion. The origin of color was but partially developed among the Greeks of his age. In other words, the ancient Greeks suffered from a universal color blindness. He later clarified this, stating, "My meaning was substantially this, that he, Homer, operated in main upon a quantitative scale, with white and black, or light and dark, and for its opposite extremities, instead of the qualitative scale opened by the diversities of color. The clear conclusion from the evidence presented by Gladstone was people in the distant past saw the world through colour differently. Vision had not had the opportunity to develop outside the basic dark light hues. The present, that is the 19th century capacity to experience the world in colour, was due to the result of the rapid evolution of the structure of the eye and exposure to artificial colours, dyes that were then available in an advanced industrial culture such as Great Britain. It was this evolution that had occurred in the subsequent generations that had enabled modern humans to develop their colour vision and therefore the ability to distinguish more colours. It was not enough just to be exposed to colour in nature. The eye needed to be educated, trained in this perception of colour. This idea of the rapid development of the structure of the eye fitted well with the theory of evolution dominant at the time, Lamarckism, which we will return to later. The next significant contribution to the controversy was Lazarus Geiger. Born in Frankfurt on Main in 1821, Geiger was a philologist. He had become interested in questions in colour perception and colour terminology through the work of Gladstone and wanted to discover if colour perception was determined anatomically or whether it was a cultural convention. Geiger was of the conviction that evolution was predominant throughout nature, and he believed that the evolution of rational thought was closely linked to the evolution of language. He believed that language evolves. At some time in the past, man would have been in the same condition as animals, without speech, without art, without religions or morals. In 1867, Geiger gave a lecture to the Assembly of German Naturalists and Physicians. Here he raised the question as to whether the structures through which we perceive the external world, particularly the eye, were the same now as they had been thousands of years ago. Sorry, I lost my place. Okay, continuing from the idea raised by Gladstone, Geiger analyzed a wide range of ancient texts, including the sacred Hindu Vedas, the Ugarit tablets from modern-day Syria, dating to the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, and the Hebrew Bible, and demonstrated that the color blue is not mentioned. A similar lack of color clarity was also present in diverse texts, including the Quran and the Islamic sagas. Careful analysis of the etymology of the word blue in European languages led him to conclude that the origins of the word lay in earlier words referring to green and black, and that this merging was also present in other languages, including Chinese. Going further, Geiger argued that by studying the sources, the etymology of color words could be regressed to a time when green was identified with yellow and even when black and red combined into a single entity. Indeed, the simplest vocabularies for color, such as found in the language of the Dani tribe of New Guinea, differentiate only in two basic colors. Mili for cool dark shades such as blue, green and black, and mola for warm light colors such as red, yellow and white. Using the ancient texts he had referenced, Geiger then began to reconstruct a chronological sequence for the development of color sensitivity in humans, from black dark through red to yellow, green, and ending with blue-violet. He stated that this hierarchy can be seen repeated in cultures around the world. This progression was evidence to Geiger of the evolutionary process he advocated. Addressing the question of color perception and its expression in language, and the fact that it emerges in the same sequence in so many diverse cultures throughout the world, Geiger reached the conclusion that the lack of color vocabulary in the language of the ancient texts must be due to deficiencies in the anatomy of the eye. Geiger published the first volume of his research, The Origin of Language, in 1869, at a time when Darwin's ideas on evolution were just beginning to gain recognition. But unfortunately, he died the following year of a heart condition, leaving his investigations uncompleted, and in time his work faded from memory. In 1875, the subject of color sensitivity had the public attention. On the 14th November 1875, two trains collided on a single line between Malmö and Stockholm in Sweden. An explanation for the crash had been put forward by Fritiof Holmgren, a doctor and professor of physiology at Uppsala University. He suggests that one of the drivers had incorrectly mistaken a red stoplight for a white go light. By devising a test, Holmgren was able to demonstrate for the first time that color blindness existed, and it could be a remnant of a condition that had existed in the past. In 1877, an unknown German ophthalmologist called Hugo Magnus published a treatise called On the Historical Evolution of the Color Sense. In the work, Magnus proposed a theory on how the retina had evolved a sensitivity to color over the previous few thousand years. His hypothesis was that the human race had moved through a series of sequential steps in the development of color vision, from none to a full color perception, recognition of the brightest colors coming first. Magnus believed that color perception did not exist in primitive man, but had evolved gradually through the exposure of the retina to light, which increased its sensitivity, thus producing color vision. The first stage in color vision, according to Magnus, was the ability of the eye to distinguish between red and black. Red was the first color to be perceived, as it was thought at that time to be the most luminous, the color with the longest wavelength and the highest energy. In the second stage, color perception separates from the sense of light, the luminosity, with red and yellow and their shades being able to be perceived. As evidence, Magnus referred to the Homeric poems where the colors red and yellow appear, but there is no mention of green or blue. In the third stage, as the sensitivity of the retina increased, the less luminous colors such as green and its variations began to appear, and in the fourth stage, blue emerges for the first time, although this stage had not then been universally reached, as was evident in confusion between green and blue that existed in the primitive tribes of the 19th century. As further proof of his theory, Magnus referred to the ideas of Newton and the spectrum of light, with red at the beginning and blue at the end. To demonstrate this, Magnus takes the example of the rainbow. Homer appears to think of it as one color, red or purple. Arab texts describe it as nadathon, red, the same phrase being applied to sunset and sunrise. The Greek philosopher Xenophanes in the 6th century BCE sees several hues of red, purple, and yellow-green in the rainbow. For Aristotle, in the 4th century BCE, it is the tricolor with red and green, but blue is now specified as a color by itself. This Aristotelian triad of colors is reproduced by Galen and appears in the work of the Indian astronomer Varahamitra in the 6th century Common Era. The 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia, the Edda, a collection of Icelandic literary works from the medieval period, until finally Newton in the 17th century established the scientific doctrine of color. There were, however, problems with the theory proposed by Magnus. Although an outline of the theory of evolution put forward by Darwin and Wallace had been published near the end of 1859, The Origin of Species, its ideas, did not become widespread until the 1880s. Magnus did base his ideas on a theory of evolution, but it was not Darwin's theory, but of an earlier theory proposed by the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck, in his Philosophie zoologique, published in 1809, proposed that physical changes in an organism that occur through its use in response to environmental changes are inherited by its offspring. Thus, the improvements that evolve in one generation are passed to the next generation. The most famous example from his publication is that of the giraffe, whose elongated neck was explained by its straining to reach the branches of a tree where food was more plentiful. Such a trait would then be passed to the next generation, and so on, and as a result, long necks would evolve. It was Lamarckism that dominated at the time of Magnus was writing. Thus, the acquisition of color perception could be explained by the inheritance of acquired characteristics passed from generation to generation. Critics of Magnus, many of whom were adherents of Darwin, began to question his claims, not least the very short time span in which such changes were meant to take place. However, no explanation was forthcoming as to the principal problem. If color vision was the same now as that experienced by peoples of antiquity, why were they unable to recognize these differences in their language for color? Why would these peoples not differentiate the colors they saw in the language they used? This then raised the question of whether our concepts of color are established by the anatomy of the eye or whether they are cultural conventions. As the biblical scholar Franz Delitzsch noted in 1878, we see in essence not with two eyes, but with three, with the two eyes of the body and with the eye of the mind, which is behind them. And it is the eye of the mind in which cultural, historical, progressive development of the color sense takes place. In fact, there had been ancient texts, such as those of the ancient Egyptians, in which the color blue had been recognized and included in their art. Indeed, Geiger had knowledge of this, but while not ignoring it, had chosen to treat this fact as an exception. The focus of the debate now began to turn away from the physiology of the eye to the inadequacies of the language used to describe the colors. Even before Magnus had published his influential work, anthropologists had begun to notice that the peculiarities observed in the ancient texts cited by Geiger still existed among peoples in various parts of the world. Adolf Bastian, a German anthropologist who traveled extensively and had noticed in 1869 that around the world there were peoples who differed from how Europeans defined the boundaries of green and blue. As evidence, he cited the Tagalog people of the Philippines. Their words for green and blue, verde and azul, were from the Spanish language, which led him to propose that these two colors had not been distinguished until after the arrival of the Europeans. He also referred to the Teta tribe in Chad, who appeared to consider green and blue as one and the same. More thorough investigations began in the 1870s, including research by Ernst Almquist, a Swedish doctor, who tested the color sense of the Chukchis of ancient Siberia, who used three color terms, black, white, and red. Albert Gatschet, an ethnologist working for the United States Geographical Survey, who used data collected on the color senses of Indian tribes. Further data was obtained by surveys compiled by Magnus himself and the Anglo-Canadian writer Grant Allen, who prepared questionnaires for missionaries to use on the natives they encountered in foreign lands. The results of these studies appeared to confirm the ideas of Geiger that color perception evolved in the same order in diverse parts of the world. However, the data collected also demonstrated that these same native peoples were able to differentiate between colors and did not suffer from defective eyesight. This highlighted the question as to why, if the natives studied were able to perceive the same colours as Europeans, they did not allocate specific names to these colours. In fact, evidence was beginning to suggest that the colours which Europeans perceived as different were actually just different shades of the same colour. In response to this new data being presented, Magnus proposed a modification to his original anatomical theory and suggested that the colours perceived by primitive peoples were not as intense as those perceived by Europeans, and that this would account for their lack of colour terms. As there were no methods available at the time to resolve the problem, progress in the field gradually ground to a halt. In 1898, Cambridge University mounted an expedition to the Torres Straits between New Guinea and northeastern Australia. One member of the party was W.H.R. Rivers, an experimental psychologist who was later to become famous as the psychiatrist who treated shell-shock casualties of the First World War, including the poet Sigrid Sassoon. The aim of the expedition was to study the mental characteristics of primitive people and compare them to civilized people, that is, Europeans. Rivers' interest was in studying the colour vision of the natives and how this related to their colour vocabulary. He proved that they could distinguish the primary colours and shades of any other colours. However, their colour vocabulary was indistinct. Although they had definite words for black, white, and red, other colour terms were less well defined, and standard terms for green and blue did not exist. Rivers reached the same conclusion as proposed by Magnus. Primitive people did not possess the same sensitivity as Europeans. It must be stated that such systems of evolutionary anthropology prevalent in Europe in the 19th century were infested with the racism of pseudoscientific apologists of imperialism and have now been completely refuted and assigned to the rubbish bin. Since then, researchers revising Rivers' work have come to an alternative conclusion. They state that primitive tribes and ancient peoples are able to perceive colour just the same as modern Europeans. The problem is not one in the physiology of the eye, but in the cultural aspects of the language. The debate lay dormant for some years until the publication in 1969 of the book Basic Colour Terms, Their Universality and Evolution, written by two linguists, Brent Berlin and Paul Kay. In the publication, the authors present a synopsis of the two basic points of view concerning the use of colour words in various languages. One perspective views languages as responsible for the systemization and arrangement of colour independently and uniquely. Therefore, we would not expect to find any universal semantics of colour terms. The other perspective, supported by the authors, is that colour words detected in languages bear no association to each other, demonstrate such a similarity that there must be an underlying deeper structure rather than mere chance. To support their argument, Berlin and Kay collected colour naming data from 20 languages. By doing systemic comparisons, they noted commonalities among the colour terms present across the languages. They were able to show that dividing the spectrum was predictable, and went on to demonstrate that languages acquired the names for colours in a certain order. They noted that if a language had basic colour terms, and if the language had only two colour words, they were consistently black and white. If there were more words, then the third was red, and the fourth and fifth green and yellow. In fact, what they had done was to rediscover the work previously put forward by Geiger in 1869. They argued that certain colours were more conspicuous and that these were the first to be named by cultures. This lack of randomness appeared to imply that there was an evolutionary structure to the acquiring of color terms. More than this, they suggested that there existed a much deeper structure which expresses a universal sharing of colors, and that this can be seen in what they termed foci. The idea is based on the observation that the participants placed more emphasis on the color focus, and that they found it more difficult to define color boundaries. They concluded that if peoples from different cultures are shown various shades of a color, they will not choose the extremes of those shades as a representation of the color, but will arrive at what can be described as a cross-cultural consensus. These are foci, and after conducting tests on subjects in 20 languages, including Arabic, Mandarin, Tagalog, Swahili, Hungarian, English, and Spanish, they included that these foci were universal constants set by biology independent of culture. In total, they listed 11 foci: white, black, red, green, yellow, blue, brown, purple, pink, orange, and grey. The role of culture was to determine how many of these foci would receive separate names, but it was nature which was responsible for the color sequence and establishing the approximate limits of the foci. The original investigation stimulated much research in the field. This led critics to highlight various errors, both in the universality of their claims and in the methodology used, and the original sequence has now been significantly modified. For example, some languages do not use separate words for color, but indicate differences through syntax, tone, and inflection. The publication of the Color Survey in 1976, using Munsell color chips, allowed researchers to develop a more complex scheme. Investigation has shown that languages with fewer basic color terms include within the term a much larger region of color space called a megacategory. For example, a stage 1 language with terms for white and black actually extends across a wide range of hues. A more accurate definition may be that white refers to light, warm colors, and black is used for dark, cool colors. A stage 2 language would then divide the original categories further, and these divisions would continue until reaching a stage 5 language. The evidence brings us to the conclusion that the nature for our understanding of color is based not on one single basis, but on two premises working in concert: nature and culture. The role of nature is present in the neurophysiology of the eye and the perception of the cardinal colors. That these divisions exist has been accepted by science. And then these divisions can be augmented and strengthened by cultural choices, which contribute to certain colors being more prominent than others. The Geiger sequence can thus be explained by a duality. The importance of red in human evolution and nature, signifying concepts such as danger, fire, and blood, is obvious. Yet red takes on a different cultural meaning in various societies around the world, being associated with happiness and good luck. Thus, the importance of red as the first prismatic color recognized must be due to its importance in both nature and culture. If it was nature alone, and therefore brightness, that was influenced the color, we would expect yellow and not red to be the most prominent prismatic color, to be designated by a separate term. That this is not the case implies that culture is influencing the order. Still, we are drawn back to the original analysis of Gladstone on the Homeric poems and its awareness that the Homeric color system there is a contrast between dark and bright. Gladstone had attempted to explain this lack of color in Homer by drawing on the prevalent theory of evolution at the time, Lamarckism, and its explanation that changes in the body parts of an organism are a response to environmental changes, and that these changes can be inherited by its offspring. This theory has since been replaced by Darwin's theory, as such changes in physiology could never occur in such a short space of time. However, the changes suggested by Lamarck can take place at a cultural level. Human beings are capable of giving rise to new color terms, and subsequent generations inherit new color conventions. So, Gladstone's claim that our perception of color has undergone a progressive education is correct, but it is not the anatomical structure of the eye that improves with practice, but that of the brain, and thus the influence of culture on anatomy. There are many questions to answer with regard to both the evolution and structure of color groupings, and it is very probable that both biological factors and social and cultural activities have played an important role in the understanding of the language of color terms. Perhaps the present state of the debate can be summarized succinctly in the expression, nature proposes and nurture disposes. That brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you for your attention. Merry Christmas, and if you have any questions, I will try and answer them.